talking now with Bill Weinberg, who does a great podcast called Counter Vortex, and we're here in
Union
Square Park in Manhattan. What do you think?
Well, for several years, Syria Solidarity New York City held a weekly Friday evening vigil here in Union Square in solidarity with the protesters in Syria and the civil resistance in Syria, which has been mobilizing every Friday since the beginning of the Syrian Revolution in 2011. And we've been, trying to raise a voice of support for the people under bombardment, under Russian bombardment in Syria for all these years. And now we're trying to raise a voice of support for the people of Ukraine who are under Russian bombardment. And critically today, for the Russians who oppose Putin and his fascistic regime and his criminal aggressions in Syria and Ukraine. Since the invasion began last February, in the immediate aftermath of the invasion, there was a huge mass mobilization of anti-war protesters all over Russia. Something like 15,000 were arrested. And many of them are still behind bars today. Many of them are facing lengthy prison terms merely for protesting, merely for raising a voice of dissent against the invasion of Ukraine. And those are the Russians who need our support, not Putin and his gang in the Kremlin, who unfortunately many deluded pseudo-leftists here in the United States seem to think we should be supporting. January 19th is a International Day of Action, which has been called by the now exiled Russian anti-war opposition in solidarity with imprisoned anti-war protesters in Russia. So hopefully we're here today in Union Square in New York City. We're just one of several events around the world.
My name is Amina, and I'm with Syria Solidarity New York City. We're here in solidarity with the people of Ukraine and the people of Russia that are against the Russian aggression. Yeah, so we're here as Syria Solidarity New York City because we have the same struggle as the Russian people who want peace and are against Russian aggression. And
that was my next question. What happened in Syria?
Well, Russia's was... Since 2015, Russia has been trying out and rehearsing what they're doing now to the Ukrainian people. They did it, and they've been doing it to the people in Syria, committing war crimes, bombing civilian targets, and so forth.
I'm Walter Dawn. I'm with the League for the Revolutionary Party. I'm also with Ukraine Socialist Solidarity. And I'd like to add to what Bill has said. It's important that socialists and other leftists be here because so many socialists and people calling themselves socialists and leftists in this country are in effect in support of the Russian attempt to crush Ukraine. There have been demonstrations and meetings that say the U.S. and NATO should stop arming Ukraine. We're for peace in Ukraine, and arming Ukraine, they say, only extends the war. The fact is, disarming Ukraine also extends the war because Ukraine has the right to self-defense. And disarming Ukraine really means let Russia win. They don't have the guts to put up banners that saying victory to Russia, crush Ukraine, but that's in effect what they mean. As a Marxist, I think we have to understand that Russia is an imperialist country, not as powerful as the imperialist U.S. It doesn't do as much evil worldwide as the imperialist U.S. does, but nevertheless, in its own region and in its own way, it is a viciously imperialist country trying to reconquer Ukraine to restore the Russian Empire of both the Tsars and of Stalin. And Putin has said that himself. And anybody who defends that position, especially on the left, ought to know they are defending Russian imperialism. They are not anti-imperialists.
Thank you.
I came out here to be in solidarity with the Russian anti-war protesters and resistors in Russia, and also with the Ukrainian resistance in Ukraine.
Yeah.
Pretty simple.
Do you think the Congress will continue to support Ukrainians' resistance?
I hopefully for the next 6 months at least, I would say. I think it's a good chance of it actually. At least the next 6 months, and hopefully that could be enough for the Ukrainian resistance to overcome.
Okay, Pete, you're down here at this rally.
Right.
Why did you come today?
Well, I came to support, to show my support for the people of Ukraine and calling, as Zelensky calls for, the United States we should be doing more. I mean, there's all this talk about tanks and all this. The United States is afraid that Russia is going to do something bad if they send 2 tanks to Ukraine, which is silly. I think that the U.S. could spare 2 tanks. I mean, they've got hundreds. I mean, we're not calling on hundreds of tanks being sent to Ukraine, just 2, and that will assist Germany and the other countries in Europe. And if they had like 100 tanks, I think there's a good chance that the war could be over by the end of 2023. If NATO sends 100 tanks to Ukraine, Ukraine just runs across the country, takes it back, and then Putin won't just surrender in the next day. But after a period of time, Putin will realize that he can't do anything, and he will just surrender.
Now, I know you've been doing things like this for a while. You and I were marching against Madeleine Albright around Iraq, and you also were involved around Syria, or I still am. Could you talk about Syria, perhaps?
Well, that's a good thing you mentioned, because I was going to, I've recently been very active about Syria, as active as possible in today's political environment, and this holds hope for Syria as well. But I think that if Putin is shamed in Ukraine, well, then it's much more difficult, because Assad has the monopoly over force in Ukraine and Syria. But the Syrian people, are still fighting back. They're still having demonstrations. There were recently demonstrations in the streets in Suwaida, in the streets in Daraa, which is very inspiring. People putting the free, Syria flag up in the streets of Syria. And so I think that there's reasons for hope, in Syria as well. And that's another thing that I think is very important. And I think that I always stood for a no-fly zone in Syria. And I think if there'd been a no-fly zone in 2015, well then, the serious situation in Syria might have been fixed then. But the United States was afraid, so they didn't. So it's the same problem, I think, the United States. So I was born in the Vietnam War days, and so I'm a peacenik, but no, I'm no longer a peacenik. I mean, when you're dealing with people like Putin, you have to use military force.